in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And at the moment, I think, I don't know what my colleagues and friends think, but I think it's being pushed backwards. It's come forward really because of the banking and the commodity crisis, where the West began to have to think, my goodness, our food system is dependent upon oil, yet again. It's a rerun of 1972-74, the oil crisis. But the modern champions of sustainable diets have been emerging, and this is what makes it such an interesting thing to be working on and in at the moment, is because from multiple directions, the pressure to change diet, not just change production, is growing. The biggest conservation organization in the world, WWF, now makes sustainable diets one of its key driving goals. They cannot protect animals from extinction unless we transform dietary changes. One of the biggest animal welfare organizations in Britain has come to the same conclusion. This week, indeed, Compassionate World Farming has launched its campaign, Stop the Machine, meaning we've got to really confront this enormity if we want to address animal welfare. In public health, the argument has grown and reports began to emerge from chief scientists around the world, Australia, set report, here in Britain, the IASTD report, all when a big rethinking was going on about how do we address the public health changes from diet apart from ecosystems changes from diet. So all the evidence has been pointing towards this. And essentially what I think is now emerging is the need to, and what Pamela Mason and I, a graduate of our centre, by the way, what we argued in the book is that essentially we've now got the need to revise Brundtland. Because the Brundtland thinking, 1987 Brundtland report essentially said sustainability is economy, environment, and society. I think in food and the sustainable diets argument, and I think Tara has been a key architect of this thinking, from whom certainly I learn, is that now that's not good enough. Health didn't feature. She, a public health doctor, of all ironies, a great woman, again, I know her slightly, did not push health as one of the drivers for sustainability. And indeed, part of my argument, part of Pamela Mason's and my argument in our book, is sustainable diets is about reclaiming health into sustainability. Many, many reports now say we want to aim for healthy and sustainable diets. Sustainability has been narrowed down to the environmental. Actually, sustainability, the whole idea about sustainability, the whole Brundtland thinking was to make it an integrating notion, that it connected economy and so on. And in the book, we use the Sustainable Development Commission's model, which is that actually we need to now use 6 headings: quality, environment, health, economy, social criteria in food, and governance. So our book is designed around a multi-criteria, multi-level model. That's what we've got to face. Third point, this is a long game. How to normalize, the theme of this session, how can we normalize sustainable diets? We're 40 years into the process of a modern thinking about it, is what I've already said. The problem is the data says we haven't got another 40 years to begin the process of change. There is a nibbling at the edges of dietary change, but not in Geoffrey Rose, my hero, the great epidemiologist, said, you know, you can take niches in populations and target them and change and improve their health, but actually it's much better to think of total populations, that you're shifting the whole population. The distribution curves may vary, but really what you want to do is shift whole populations. So you still will get variations between people, between social groups, between income groups, between ethnic groups, between regions, but you're basically, if you aim to shift the population, then you get the requisite scale of change. And his thinking was informed just by non-communicable diseases. If you add ecosystems to that, wow, does that argument become even more important. And the problem is this, is that we've got 70 years where policy has said the answer to food is just produce more. The way you deal with Malthus's problem is just produce more. It's what Mike Heathman and I in the centre has called and tried to promote the notion of productionism, not productivism, which in agricultural studies has a particular meaning, but productionism, that just you deal with production and you don't even consider consumption. Productionism has been very, very successful as a policy framework. It's basically what we've all been brought up in. But it was based upon 1930s and 1940s science. They didn't conceive of non-communicable diseases. They didn't conceive of ecosystems problems being driven by the food system. They did not conceive of it. I've read voluminously in that, and everyone I know who has comes to the same conclusions. But in the 1970s, productionism went into a second version of where it was essentially marketized. That this should just be left to market relations. So it should be individualized, up to the individual consumer to choose wisely, and that would reshape food systems. This is a very naive approach to policy. Indeed, labels don't work. They do if you've had a heart attack, they're very useful. Or if you have a baby, people use them. But do they shift whole populations in Jeffrey Rose's sense? No. Now think, how could you put all the criteria that you want to put about sustainability of foods onto a dietary format? Well, it took us 25 years to get quantitative ingredients declarations, QIDs, into labels in Europe. We haven't, again, got the time to be able to put carbon counting, water counting, biodiversity impacts of particular foods, let alone all the things. It's beyond the concept of a label. It's going to have to be addressed culturally. Fourth point, if our challenge, the thing we want to debate today, the thing that Corinna is asking us at the centre to really focus on, which I agree with completely, is how can we normalize this? Well, it means we've got to have better indicators of what is necessary. Again, in the book, and Tara has done this, we're all exploring it. Corinna, Tara, and I are all three of us on a Lancet commission looking at the moment at sustainable diets, but it's called, I've had the argument, healthy diets from sustainable food systems. I'm saying it should be sustainable diets. Why is health separated from ecosystems? But anyway, there we go, that's what it is. We've basically got to try and address this complexity issue. What is it that we want? Now, I hesitated whether to even put this up. Note the brilliance and clarity of this graphic. Now, it's actually just gone to Tara. This is, I'm co-chair of the policy working group of the Eat Lancet Commission, which is basically some mega brains and big modeling is being done of the whole world of food. Essentially what it's concluding is that what we've got to do is try and talk about transitions. We're dealing with transitions. How can we transition from what I've called Udaf's world, unhealthy diets from unsustainable food systems, because that's what the data says we have at the moment, to healthy diets from sustainable food systems on the right-hand side. So we want to go from this world to a future world, and we've got to do it quite fast. Actually, what I think the data say is that we've got health being pushed, led by deracinated culture, consumerism, cost, a rise of ultra-processed foods. My standard example in the book, updated. Coca-Cola, $4 billion of advertising budget every year. That's twice the entire budget of the World Health Organization. One company, okay? For the whole of health. If we just look at health promotion in WHO, it's 24 times, I think. So basically the trends are encouraging us to eat unhealthy diets, and the same, there are trends pushing, we have a working group on trends in the Lancet Commission, to make food unsustainable. This is messier, I'm doing it schematically. So the gap between health of diet and sustainability of the food system is all the time trying to pull apart. Actually, what we want to get it to is where healthy diet, sustainable diet, and the sustainability of the food system are interlocked. They're reinforced by this rotation of positive social norms, support for behavior change, nutrition integrated into the food supply, diet and supply aligned, in other words, not a gap in tension like that. How can we get this world, citizens who know not to eat too much meat, not to be told not to eat meat, but they just know that they don't eat much meat and are prepared to pay a lot of money for it, so that it pays the full internalized price? This is a different world. That's what the data say we should be doing. Are we making progress on this? Well, I think a lot about this. This is what I want to hear what Tara, whom I respect, and Modi, who I respect greatly too, and is leading a fabulous review for UK Health Forum. I want to know whether they agree with me here. I wrote, actually, and made my wife and grandson laugh hysterically when I said, yes, but no, but. I think that's what we can conclude. On the one hand, we've got the international really important frameworks, the Sustainable Development Goals, 169 targets, 70 of them are food. All of these are saying, and even the British government has signed up to those. But are we now translating those at the national level, Tara? No. Only Sweden is a country which dared to have an evidence-based sustainable dietary guidelines. In Brazil, my friend Renato is here from Brazil, you did too, but you gave it as nutrition guidelines from the Ministry of Health. It was environment-proofed, but it didn't actually overtly say this is to put environment and health together. It was still the nutrition and health guidelines. What you did that was brilliant in Brazil was you focused on culture. You actually said, we've got to stop Brazil going through this nutrition transition of beginning to eat more and more ultra-processed foods, which then end up with this world. So Brazil and now Sweden, having been made to withdraw those official dietary guidelines, sustainable dietary guidelines, it was made to withdraw them by the European Food Safety Agency, authorities, sorry. It was an absolute scandal. Evidence-based sustainable dietary guidelines by the equivalent of the National Food Administration, their Food Standards Agency, and their Environmental Protection Agency. They were made to withdraw it. I don't know if you know this, but they were made to withdraw it for 3 reasons. One, it was against the single market. They said eat locally. Secondly, they said eat seasonally. And thirdly, they said eat little meat. Poland complained, almost certainly put up by American food company now bought by the Chinese, the biggest meat producer in the world. This is remarkable. So this is very highly political capital P stuff. This isn't lightweight stuff. This is absolutely getting to the heart of it. But meanwhile, Britain has actually now added, Tara and I celebrated it, and we both said nice things about it. Public Health England in Britain has now put on the Eat Well plate, eat less red and processed meats. Hasn't given any data on it. I want to know whether Modi agrees. Should we be arguing for data on it, translating it? But I think it's fantastic that Public Health England has done that. And that, I think, is where I get, yes, we are making progress. It's fantastic that actually last year Public Health England did that when they previously sat on their hands. And that came out of collaboration between Public Health England and the Carbon Trust. So there are some really interesting things. The German government's Commission on Sustainable Development produced its 3rd edition of its advice to consumers. And it said everything the Swedish government said. Eat locally, eat seasonally. But it said use it by using logos, funnily enough, using consumer logos. So I think there's some interesting policy watching. Australia looked like its nutrition revision was going to introduce sustainable dietary guidelines. They'd written it, we know, because one of our fellows is a member of it, the committee, and they were hit by a Monty Python foot from a very high height, namely the Australian meat industry, and they're made to withdraw it, and there's a little bit mentioned in the appendix. So this is very political with a big P. To end, where are opportunities, Corinna? I think there are always opportunities, but I would say that I'm a breech baby. I'm always optimistic. I always think you can come out backwards, but there's something good to do. So I understand my friends who are pessimistic about it, but definitely time is very tight. I think Brexit is a bit of a nightmare, but we could argue for this. We could argue for sustainable dietary guidelines. We could argue for sustainable food communique that the European Union was about to publish and again was then stopped. We could build upon some of the big companies who I think are getting very worried about this. I've got my two water gurus at the front here. We know only too well some of the big food companies are seriously worried about water stress and are beginning to do very interesting things. But again, they're not talking to consumers about it. They're trying to address it by choice editing below the radar, not telling consumers, but just trying to reduce the impact out of sight and out of mind of consumers. But for me, and I don't know what you think, Corinna, for me, really, the really big hope is actually the city level. There is a really interesting upsurge of cities around the world beginning to engage more directly with their consumers. And I don't know how many of you know, but last year, 2 years ago, in Milan hosted Expo 2015, and on World Food Day, October the 15th, they had God himself, literally the Pope, launching the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, signed by 100 cities around the world. This was an extreme, I always say, I was deeply moved. I was there. It was very moving to hear the mayor of Shanghai who said, I'm responsible for food for 20 million people. And if you don't know about China, let me just tell you, people in the position of mayors have been known to be shot if things go wrong. If you follow food safety, people are periodically in responsible positions taken away and dealt with if things go wrong. So when he said, I'm responsible, you knew he meant the word responsibility in a very serious way. So I think this is a very interesting movement now. 120 cities around the world on every continent, obviously except Antarctica, have signed up to that. So I'm actually very positive about that. I'm very positive that it's NGOs that are pushing this. I think here in Britain we have a fabulous coalition, the Eating Better Coalition, which is now 45 NGOs. These are the democratic experimentalists who are pushing and creating the policy space. But my point is still back to where I began, and I'm ending here. Which is the gap between how we're eating in rich countries like Britain and the unsustainability of the food system is yawningly wide, but we know enough in policy terms to be able to act, but we haven't got the political will. And that's where we are. And my fear, my no but, to my answer, where are we now? Where are our opportunities? My no but is that really the track record of big changes in food policy is that they come out of crisis. And I mean really big. You get incremental change, you get good things happening, lots of really important things are happening in this terrain. But the seismic shift, the qualitative shift, that's a better word, that this diagram is trying to capture, I don't want it to be a crisis. You could argue, of course, we are actually in a crisis, and this is therefore the opportunity. So thanks.
This is really just an aside, the fact that these issues have been knocking around for ages and ages and ages. And I actually recently finished reading quite an interesting book about our relationship with animals over time, historically, since year dot. And one of the things that was extremely striking was that, you know, back when the Greeks were busy engendering Plato and producing works of great sculpture, they were also busy deforesting the peninsula because of the machinery of their appetite for endless sacrifices. So, you know, this is not new. The fact that we trash the planet for whatever, you know, obsession that we currently have, this is an old thing. And I think that's worth remembering, because I might come back to it right at the end. This idea that when we look at what we think we want as a sustainable food system, sometimes there's the temptation to go back to some hypothetical idyllic point in the past when it was all just much better. And generally speaking, it probably wasn't. It was just very different. So that was kind of one point I wanted to make. And the other point was going back to Tim's point about the need to say sustainable diets rather than healthy and sustainable diets, which is, you know, almost tautologous, and the fact that the original Brundtland Commission definition of sustainable development encompassed the kind of the societal, the environmental, and the economic dimensions. And I think that's useful up to a point, but this so-called three-legged stool is not an equal three-legged stool. It's not an equal three-legged stool at the moment because the economy trumps everything. But the other point to note is that the economy is not a law, a natural law like gravity. It is something we've created. And so when we talk about planetary boundaries, they're not rigid, they're porous, but more or less, the more we go in a certain direction, the less livable our planet will be for us and for other life forms. And therefore, I would argue that those have a sort of a certainty about them. Same with health. Up to a point, people are amazingly adaptable. People can more or less survive on jam sandwiches, but there are limits, and we have certain physical non-negotiables. We have demands for shelter, for all the other things. But the economy, other than providing a means of living and sustenance and validation for people, is flexible. So what I think is really dangerous is that when people say sustainability has to incorporate everything, what they're really meaning is they're saying the economy trumps everything. And I think we need to be very careful about that. And I think we also need to be very careful when we talk about the role of culture and tradition. Again, food is so important. We all eat it for way more reasons than simply to fuel ourselves. But at the same point, as Tim has already pointed out, it's infinitely malleable and in flux all the time. So I think we have to think about those things. Another point is that, again, focus on diets and consumption, really, really important, but there is a very porous dynamic interface between the production and the consumption side, as well as Corinne is always pointing out, the stuff in between. So if you take something like wheat, it can be whole grain bread or donuts. If you take something like aquaculture, currently as aquaculture is practiced, it causes quite a lot of damage. So you could say there is a trade-off between the undoubted health benefits of eating fish and the point that wild harvest fisheries and aquaculture are problematic. But if we changed our fishing practices, if we developed more sustainable systems of aquaculture, there would be no trade-off. So we need to think, and so what constitutes a healthy, sustainable diet will depend on changes in the production base as well. So that's another point worth mentioning. Another point is, and I think Tim has pretty much said this, is this focus. We need to focus not so much on consumers, but on the problem of consumerism. And this struck me, partly because, like probably everyone in this room, I hate this word consumers, because we're people and we also consume stuff, but we are people. But I have to go and give a talk in a couple of weeks' time to a group of lawyers, and I've never given a talk to lawyers before, so I thought, actually, I better do some homework, and especially as they might really attack my arguments because they're lawyers. And effects everything. It affects the sighting of another fried chicken shop. It affects the fact that whether you can bring your case of morbid obesity to court. Their legal obligations.
Thank you, Corinna and Tim, for the opportunity to reflect on this really interesting presentation that Tim has given. I had a few points. Can you guys hear me at the back? No. If I use the microphone, will that amplify my voice?
No. It's just recording you.
Oh.
You just have to shout.
Okay. Okay, I'll try. Can you hear me better now if I try and shout? Okay.
If anyone wants to come forward.
Yeah, feel free to come forward.
And I know that's probably a pain, but carry on.
Okay, so yeah, I had a few reflections on what you were saying, Tim. First of all, I agree about the lack of traction on sustainable diets. More broadly, I'm a nutritionist and I work for a health organisation, the UK Health Forum. We're focusing on trying to get government to adopt policies which can shift the population's lifestyles, for want of a better word, towards more healthy approaches which can help prevent non-communicable diseases. And I worked on nutrition policy for quite a number of years in this country, but have never really focused on the sustainable diet side of things. We tend to focus on nutrition as opposed to incorporating the environment and other social cultural aspects. And I'll go on to explain some of the reasons why I think that is. But in the last year or so, or 2 years, my organisation has become increasingly interested in looking at how we can promote more healthy and sustainable diets, partly because we haven't had much success in terms of meeting the current health objectives in nutrition that we'd like the population to meet.
Sustainability was not on the agenda for that convening. We as civil society kept making the arguments that actually if we're going to review the Eat Well Guide and the healthy eating guidance because we've got new sugar in the guidelines, why don't we also consider other things like sustainability? The Sustainable Development Goals were just about to be adopted internationally. We saw it as a good opportunity to actually think about a broader refresh of the plate. I didn't really think it was going to get very far, but Eating Better was a really key ally. So I set up a group with other NGOs who were interested in this process and were consulting them, getting the evidence and the arguments to PhD on why it was we thought some of these other considerations needed to be considered. And Eating Better were very good at coming up with the evidence and the arguments for why incorporating sustainability within the Eat Well Guide would help to strengthen its recommendations and also have benefits for things like the environment. So that process of working in collaboration with an NGO like Eating Better eventually helped us to actually get some of these sustainability considerations incorporated within the Eat Well Guide, even though the original remit that they had been given for refreshing it did not include sustainability. So I'm really pleased we have that. It's a big win. At the moment, we don't really have a policy action that's following through to implement those recommendations, so we're not necessarily having any national policy action around reducing the intake of meat as a population, for example. Another thing, Tim, that you said needed to happen was, for instance, quantifying the Eat Well Guide in terms of what are the actual changes that need to happen to help the population meet those guidelines. So the revision of the segments involved a modelling exercise where colleagues from the University of Oxford modelled the changes that would be needed to each of the different segments. So what changes were needed on the meat section, what changes were needed to fish, what changes were needed to fruit and vegetables, what changes were needed to dairy, for instance, to actually meet the recommendations within the Eat Well Guide. And they were looking at these changes based on what people are currently eating versus what changes would be needed to meet the new recommendations. And the changes they came up with were pretty substantial. So for meat, for instance, the modelling suggests that we would need to see reductions of 78% in current consumption levels of meat. This is a modelled diet, it's not an actual diet. But if we as a population were to meet the Eat Well Guide as it currently stands, our meat intake would need to reduce by 78%.
I'm supposed to say one. massive change.
No, it
It's
is.
that.
Exactly. Similarly for fish, consumption would basically need to pull report from the current levels in order to kind of meet the targets that were within those. For pulses, our consumption needs to double roughly in terms of that food group. And then similarly for fruit and vegetables, our consumption will again need to increase by around 50%. And actually it will need to go from, at the moment we have this 5-a-day recommendation of around 80 grams a portion. But actually in order to meet the EGOL guide as it currently stands, we'll need to exceed the 5 portions, which equal around 400 grams, to go up to around 500 grams. So we need to increase our intake of fruit and vegetables to around 6 to 7 gram portions a day, as opposed to the target 5 grams. But this information isn't necessarily being communicated to the population, that the size of the shifts from what we're currently eating to actually meet this EGOL guide, which incorporates elements of sustainability, but could actually go further. It doesn't go as far as other places like Sweden. So there's a big gap at the moment between the guidelines that are out there and the efforts and communication to the public around what's actually needed to shift our current diet. So, I agree with you that the reasons why at the moment our diets are so poor is because our current food production system is unsustainable. The reason why we're eating, one of the reasons why we're eating so much meat is because we look at the land mass, for instance, the agricultural land mass that we have in the UK, 50% of that land is currently used to produce meat or meat-related things like animal feed, as opposed to fruit and vegetables. Just around 2 or 3% of our land is currently used for growing horticulture or fruit and vegetables for meat consumption. Although we produce some meat and pulses in this country, the majority of them are the ones that are ready for human consumption are exported to other places like Egypt, where they eat more meat and pulses than us, or they're used for animal feed. So there's a disconnect between what we're currently producing and what we're currently eating for our health. And we're not yet in this space where we're both producing food sustainably and consuming food sustainably. I think linked to that, there's also generally lack of awareness around the links between health and sustainability, both within the public and within the wider nutrition community and much more broadly. And I think we need to have much more communication and awareness campaign around that. Tara, you mentioned alcohol before, and one of the things we found out, I never knew this before, is that your average glass of wine, yesterday in the news, we heard that even just drinking half a glass of wine a day increases the risk of breast cancer. So we need to, basically cut down on our alcohol intake in this country. Cancer, heart disease, diabetes, they're some of the biggest killers and linked to the consumption of wine and other alcohol products. But an average 125ml glass of wine, that's a very small glass, uses around 109 litres of water to produce. People don't know this. Not all that water isn't necessarily bad for the environment. It's not necessarily having a net loss, but some of it is from rainwater, for instance, depending on the region it's produced. But that's still a lot of water in that tiny glass of wine that you're drinking, and we don't know about it. There are countries in the world where we're getting this wine from, where they have massive water shortages. And if people knew this, that might be another motivator for them to perhaps cut down on their wine intake. Likewise with chocolate, and I admit to liking chocolate myself, but an average 100-gram bar of chocolate will use around 1,700 litres of water to produce. That is a significant amount of water, which the general public don't know about. But I mean, it could be for some another motivator for them to perhaps consider having less chocolate because they need to have less chocolate. Health reasons, weight reasons, as well as environmental reasons. So I do think there needs to be a lot of work around that to help just, raise awareness both amongst the public as well as policymakers make these arguments change. Coming back to the issue of nutrition as a nutritionist, I mentioned I was involved, for instance, in government policy update of the EGOL guide. I think there are some challenges to why nutrition is not currently looking at sustainability, and many of the nutrition actors are not looking at sustainability. I think the nutrition agenda has been hijacked trying to reduce the packaging, so they're free from more environmentally sustainable. But there isn't this talk about, well, maybe you should actually eat less of your ultra-processed food products and then switch back to eating more pulses and fish and thinking about those kinds of solutions instead. So I think that's a challenge. From our partners, we're the NGO I work for, we're an alliance of organisations. We have around 80 members, and a lot of the members who are interested in nutrition are still learning about sustainability. We're doing a project that we're asking them why it is they're not currently engaged. But they have low levels and awareness of sustainability, the environment, the clear benefits for nutrition, as I alluded to before. They don't see that there are any effective, cost-effective solutions in the way that we can point to a sugary drinks tax as a solution to obesity. What is the equivalent for sustainability that we can all get behind and say the government needs to do this? It is complex. There probably isn't a single solution. But those are the kinds of things I think they may want to have in order to get behind this particular agenda. Their resources are limited. They're not going to focus on things that they don't think are going to work or have traction. They have to prioritise them, which is why at the moment everyone's focused on childhood obesity and things like this, the sugary drinks tax, for instance. So in terms of what I think needs to happen, first of all, we do have, although it's not perfect, we do have an Eat Well guide which incorporates sustainability concerns. We should mobilise around that as a starting point, really pushing the government to start acting on it and implementing the recommendations within it. At the beginning of this, I've earlier mentioned the significant changes that are needed at the moment to our consumption patterns in order to meet that. Why haven't we got an action on that? We need the government to develop a sustainable food system strategy that starts to address some of those goals within there. And we need to develop some of the frames and solutions in order to meet that. We don't have those off-the-shelf solutions at the moment that people can point to. And also we need to have more, in the same way that we need cross-government collaboration between the bits of government that deal with the environment, agriculture, production, health. We need the same degree of collaboration within the civil society NGO community. I mean, for us, for instance, it's only the last year or so, 2 years, that we started talking to our NGOs who are working in food, but from the environmental side. And there are not many of us in nutrition who are working with the environmental groups, so we need more of that to happen as well. So I'll end there, but yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
And to Tara for your reflections and Tim for your opening talk. So what I'd like to do now is to ask you to share what reflections you've had. You don't have to have a question, but a comment not too long. There are quite a few people here, and we've already heard some good talks, but some reflections that you've had based on what you've heard today. As I said, you could have a question, but we're really looking for reflections that then I'd ask you to reflect back on. I'm just going to share my first reflection. As I was listening to you talk, I found myself thinking about the globe. You mentioned planetary boundaries, the risks of sustainability to the planet. But we spoke a lot about the UK, which is understandable, and Sweden and so on. But I've been thinking a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN goals to guide global development, and which have this principle in them of universality. The idea that all countries need to be involved. It's not just the global north and the global south, but also about equality. It's about all people. So does the Sustainable Diets Agenda really address the issues of the poorest people in the poorest countries? Is it about them? Is it so I'd love to hear some responses from you on that, and that was my reflection. So who would like to start here?
Hi everyone, my name is Maria Luisa Bostolescu and I work at the Economist Intelligence Unit.
Ask you, it's not an amplifying microphone.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Sorry
about that.
you
could amplify, thank you.
Sure. So can anyone hear me? Okay. So I work on a project called the Food Sustainability Index, and I think you might have heard of it. So when I was designing the framework of the index, which collects 55 indicators on sustainable food systems, one of the biggest challenges was how to define sustainable diets. And in the discussions that I've had, a lot of people were opposing healthy diets and sustainable diets. So again, trying to say, well, if it's sustainable, it won't be healthy, or the other way around. And one of the indicators that I used was to look at the number of people per fast food restaurant in countries to find out if diets are changing, or and the problem is the food industry is very radicalized or very aggressive. And I've received some feedback from people who work in the food industry, especially someone from Brazil in the sugarcane industry, who were almost, accusing me of trying to destroy McDonald's business model and all that. And so my question is, how do we, manage to get through this opposition from the food industry? And have you ever had any challenges from the food industry, and how do you, manage to not be accused of being, the big bad communists, basically? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Sorry, could you say who you are and your organisation, if you have one, before you speak, please?
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Bauke. I'm here with the Dutch Embassy, but it's a personal question. I heard a lot about sustainable diets and food policy, but what role do you think that agricultural policy should play in making the food policy that we have more sustainable? Because I was just thinking, if a McDonald's, for example, would have more sustainable products and cheaper products, then it would already be a little bit easier to shape sustainable food policy.
Hello, my name's Stephanie. I work in the campaigns team at the RSPB. Following on from that, I'm really curious. Tim, you started off saying we talk about sustainable diets, but of course part of that is sustainable production. And what are your views collectively on how important it is to focus on diet? And that's the point at which we encounter our food as people who will therefore or could want change, versus production, which is the point at which a lot of the specific actions that drive the largest damage can happen.
Thanks. I'll take two more comments, one here and then one here.
Anne Hewen, a consultant. I used to be with the NGO community, but also with Unilever for 23 years, so I've actually worked in the food industry too. I think my comments are really that I think you do have to look differently. I think, having been like Tim, I feel rather long in the tooth, and I feel disruption has to come in. It has to be a disruptor technique to make a difference. We haven't got time, and maybe that is using consumers. So maybe this comment that was made about social media, and I understand, Tara, your reluctance, and I can feel it and see it. Maybe they have got to be the powerhouse. We've tried too often to work through the norms of government, of industry, but maybe actually we really do need now a really strong consumer movement. I mean, I was yesterday at that lovely place, Chelsea, because I'm part retired, so I can do these things, and the food was appalling. It was hamburgers, fish and chips. I think there was falafel I managed to choose, but that was it. So, we need to get consumers on our side too, but of course with checks and balances around that. I'm not saying we don't have government policy and regulation.
Thank you. Reflection and
my name is Sabrina Roger. I'm a lecturer in environmental law at the University of Sheffield, one of those people lawyers. So I have two questions, but I'm going to save time because my first one was the same one. So yes, if we are against manipulation, information is not enough. If we need cultural change and we need it quickly, what do we do? And the second one is, I read a paper recently on how the opposition to some big problems, for example, climate change, is not really an opposition to the problem or its understanding of the problem, it's an opposition to the solutions. So if the solution is eat less chocolate and drink less wine, how do we do that? that.
Thank you. Can I ask you to briefly reflect on the reflections? Starting with
Well, those are very interesting. Well, let's take Corinna first. I think one of the criticisms 30 years ago about the sustainable diet agenda was that this was about rich countries. It wasn't about poor countries. One of the things that has really heartened me in the last 15 years is now I can go to any poor developing country and they see we are the people in the front line of environmental change. We are the people most at risk. You rich countries actually can adapt. We are the ones who are being crucified. And that has actually brought a huge amount of interest from developing countries and low-income countries into not wanting to go through a nutrition transition that they cannot afford and that their own ecosystems can't possibly engage with. They've been one of the biggest drivers, developing countries and low-income countries, for the Sustainable Development Goals. Actually, it was the rich countries who wanted to ignore it and to not address it. But having said that, some very powerful players among the rich countries, as you know better than I do, actually swung the UN system to back the SDGs. I think we're now in a position where the SDGs give us a framework. For me as a policy man, like your good self, we now have a global framework. But what we've not got is that translated. And I'll go now to Anne Hewen's comment at the end. I'm actually increasingly going with Anne, and I think this is very interesting. This is someone who I've known a long time, who worked at Unilever for a quarter of your life, third of your life, half your professional life. Seeing that actually by disruption we mean really quite significant change. And I am sensing, I don't know about you, Anne, but I'm sensing the consumer movement around the world was actually worried about Corinna's criticism. They did think this was a rich country concern. Now they're getting from their low-income country consumer movements a really strong push to address sustainability in dietary change. So I think that twin is very, very interesting. Very quickly, the others, the EIU, if you don't know it, the Economist Intelligence Unit was asked to develop this very interesting beginning of a global review of sustainable diets. And I put in my toponym, I smiled because I think that indicator you pointed out was partly my fault. But I think if not that indicator, we need other indicators like that. I understood you in that indicator wanting to have something that we could measure across different countries and get good data on it. The difficulty, however, I feel in self-criticism, is that that was a measurable indicator for where McDonald's is located, but it didn't deal with something that I know Corinna is interested in, street food. Street food is actually a huge purveyor of food in low-income countries, actually very cheap food, accessible. It's a myth that poor people don't eat out. They eat out hugely. They just eat out in different locations, and we don't have such good data on it. So I think we've got to actually go beyond those issues. I agree with you. On the issue, what role can agriculture play? I think agriculture is feeling very beleaguered at the moment. But I'm an ex-farmer, so I declare an interest. I always think every morning I wake at 5:30 and think I'm going to milk cows. Then I go back to sleep and think, thank God I'm not milking cows, and go and make a cup of tea, imperialist tea. I think agriculture is actually acutely aware, and agriculturalists acutely aware around the world of the environmental pressures on them. But what they aren't is engaged in the policy world. We haven't helped them. 75%, Corinna, you know this even better than me, 75% of all agricultural producers are actually sort of out of the market. They're not in the mass market of food commodities. And there is a real disconnect. And I think this sustainable diet agenda that we are all in, we've got to actually connect with small and primary producers. The fabulous Mario Herrera paper. Anyone who's on the centre distribution list, we just circulated that. It shows, it reminds us how important small producers are. You know, the FAO always reminds us 75% of all food grown in the world comes out of small producers. In rich countries like us, that's not the case. So you're right. Stephanie from RSPB, well, come on, you're the doyens of this. This is your the pot calling the kettle black here. I mean, you're a big landowner. You're also a major NGO and BirdLife in Europe. You're in a very powerful position. And what in code I was trying to say, I will now say overtly to you, knowing you're in the room. I think you've got to do like WWF and International World Farming, and I know your boss, I was with him the other day, or the week to Corinna and I were, the head, is acutely aware that RSPB is not going to protect bird life unless it deals with the dietary pressures on agriculture. So I see a really important alliance emerging, and that's what I think we're all saying. Modi was saying it very clearly. We're seeing health organisations realising, you know, it's our word, sustainable diets. It's not a catchy one for politicians, particularly. Well, they're fond enough, they're getting it. So I see that emphasis as really an opportunity for you, like the National Trust. The National Trust, 4.4 million members, has a food policy. But what it hasn't got is a sustainable diet food policy. That's what we need to try and encourage them to do, and I think that's coming. So I see in all of these bits, all of your comments, very interesting indicators of the yes but element of my ending. There's a lot of positive things happening. But I don't think we've got it at sort of sufficient level of activity, which was Anne Hewen's point at the end. It's a very overview.
Great. So, the order, I don't know. So sustainable diets.
Oh, I didn't do the law. No, you did.
Okay. Sustainable diets.
They have no sense of humour, by the way. That's the thing that when you speak, they do in private. When you speak to a conference of lawyers, be prepared for everyone to be stony-faced.
Okay, that's true.
It is awful. You speak to them and you think, have I farted? Am I doing something wrong? They look at you completely impressive. Be prepared. I have done many talks to lawyers, and then afterwards they're charming.
They're lasting all the way to the back.
They are, that's so rich. Is it fresh bits? Who are you talking to?
Yeah.
You'll need fresh bits.
Yeah.
I knew you'd need fresh bits.
Anyway, sustainable diets does it work in developing countries? It can't afford not to work. And I mean, this is a contraction of convergence model. Diets in low-income countries are terrible. They need to be made better. Diets in high-income countries are not good for different reasons. They need to converge on a place where you're having a health-enhancing way of eating that sits within environmental limits. So, and of course, the other point is that the developing world accounts for most of global agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, most of the global consumption of animal products, and is going to contribute to most of the rise in greenhouse gas emissions in coming years. So if they are not part of it, then they will be suffering more than anyone else from climate change, and they will be effectively cutting off the branch they're sitting on. And this is about intergenerational justice among other things. But it's about better diets. That's the main point. Better diets than what there is today. On agricultural policy, yes, I mean I was trying to make this point in the comments that we can't talk about consumption without talking about production and the systems within that, including the provisioning system that gets stuff from the field to the plate and all the actors in between. Agricultural policy affects what it is we produce and how much of it. It affects how we produce it, and it also affects the terms with which we trade. And so that deals with the whole rebounds and leakage. You know, we can turn vegan overnight in this country, but if we continue to be producing lots of animal products and export the product problem, then there is no net gain in anything. So yeah, it's absolutely core and fundamental. The comment about that the lawyer made about values and the fact that we sort of all agree about climate change, people don't like the solutions. Again, that was something I was trying to bring out, but I would really recommend a wonderful book that was written by somebody called Mike Hugh, who's a professor at King's, and he wrote a book called Why We Disagree About Climate Change, and his central point is that we all agree, apart from Donald Trump and a few others, climate change is real, anthropogenic and problematic, but whether we see it as a kind of moral malaise or as just a technical problem that needs fixing is where all the problems start, where the disagreements begin. And then finally, so linking to the values, on disruptive change and the role of social media, I guess my only comment is be careful what you wish for, because, I know as an academic that you can give people evidence, people don't really care because it's how they're feeling. And so the logical conclusion of that is go with how people are feeling and just get them to feel slightly feel good but do different. And you can get all sorts of really dangerous things happening. You get gangs, you get exclusion, you get reinforcement of your worldview without any engagement of your critical faculties. So I'm going to make a play for using our heads rather than just going for the kind of tweety stuff, because I really don't like it.
I don't mind Twitter, but I think on that, on that point, I don't know how far we can get with trying to change consumer behaviour through that kind of social mobilisation. Whilst I do engage with some social media, I don't necessarily think that that's going to solve the problems that we're talking about. I also don't think we're necessarily going to have consumer-driven change as the solution to this problem. It's just too big for that. So it might. I certainly think it probably has a role to play, but I don't think it's going to bring about the disruptive change which I really need. On the question about is it a global problem, yes, agree with Tim and Tara on that. It absolutely is. And just reflecting, as someone who comes originally from a developing country, a lot of aspects of diets in developing countries are not so great, but then there are other really positive things. So like Tara was saying, people don't eat lots of meat, but then things like beans and pulses, which we need to eat lots more in this country, are just a natural staple that go along with rice. So there are positive aspects of traditional diets in low and middle income countries that need to be protected, and I don't think we're necessarily doing enough around them. This whole consumerism, globalization agenda is undermining those, and in some ways we need to work out how we can persuade populations in low and middle income countries to protect the good aspects of the diets they do have. There's some good progress coming from parts of Latin America, like the Brazilian guidelines. They're all about promoting some of their traditional local foods, and they need to take pride in those things. We need to encourage more of that, but perhaps it shouldn't be a Western-driven solution. Equally, here in the West, we are also starting to adopt aspects of diets from other parts of the world and making them really trendy. So, for instance, quinoa is a popular food that's now consumed by the middle classes in this country, whereas it was peasant food in parts of Latin America. The peasants there should carry on eating quinoa and be encouraged to do so. But part of the perhaps the side effect of these kind of foods being made trendy here is they're becoming more expensive in the places where they're originating from, and they're being exported as opposed to consumed locally. So it's a global problem, and I don't know what the solutions are, but some of those things might be the solutions. The question around the role of industry, yes, some bits of industry really do oppose some of the solutions that are needed. There was a lot of backlash to the updated Eat Well guide that PHE did because of some of the recommendations around reducing, some of the food groups. And even though some of the recommendations weren't made explicitly, like for instance, you must eat less dairy. Just the fact that the proportion of the segment in dairy reduced a little bit, even though there was no public communication that this needed to change. The dairy industry was up in arms around that. So there is always going to be that kind of opposition. I don't know what the solutions are to that. One of the things that could be done is, in terms of changing consumer behaviour, a reason why we in public health like them is taxes, because if you were to reflect the two externalities to society in the cost of products like wine, chocolate, eating those foods increases your risk of disease. These diseases cost the economy, the NHS, a lot of money. If the costs of the NHS were to be reflected in the price, so instead of paying £5 for a glass of wine or £10 for a glass of wine, you pay £50 or £80 to reflect the cost of cancer that you will also be paying to the NHS when you get it. People might then consume less, so you're still paying the same amount of money, but you're just paying it in a different way. So I mean, that could be a solution that's explored. It's worked for tobacco, where tobacco taxes are very high relative to the cost of the product and consumption has come down. That's why we like to promote taxes as a solution to changing consumer behaviour. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it there in terms of comments.
Thank you very much. I'll take this one. Okay, and I'm very interested that the comments and reflections that we've had have been kind of going back to the big problem of food policy, which is the relationship between production and consumption and producers and consumers, and this tension between whether we intervene in consumption and whether we intervene in production, and it's interesting that we are still having this discussion and a reflection of just how important that debate is in the food policy and food systems space. So on that note, do we have any more reflections from the floor?
While it's been passed, we should ask Tara about China. China has made a commitment now, we discussed it in the book, to reduce meat production. Did you know that? Production and consumption. So it's now got a conflict between production and consumption. Author of a major report on China. So I think we should discuss that.
Please.
Hi, my name is Sky. I'm from the Food and Drink Federation. Hi, my name is Sky. I'm from the Food and Drink Federation. This is more of a personal question, though. So I work in the communications function, and I know people are bombarded with information about what they should and shouldn't eat, and I feel like that contributes to fatigue about changing your diets. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on mitigating or kind of unifying the messages people are getting around these things.
Thank you. And another one here, and then another one there.
Hi, I'm Sam. I work at a sustainability consultancy called 3Keel, but personal question again. I was wondering what you think the role of education is in dealing with this issue of sustainable diets. From my own experience, the treats we have and what we enjoy, it's sort of embedded in us by the time we become adults. Has too much happened already? Can we go back from that? Yeah.
Hello, I'm a farmer. Worse than that, I'm a meat farmer. And worse than that, I'm dairy and meat. And I do get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and milk cows. My point really is one of, there was a discussion earlier about the difference between wheat products as being wholemeal loaves and donuts or bagels at the other end of the spectrum. And within the spectrum of dairy, there is a huge range of production systems. And we are in the middle of an experiment which is going to achieve ecosystem service outcomes. 90% reduction in fertilizer usage and antibiotic usage and anthelmintic usage, the cutting of greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, and that's without particularly trying yet. The delivery of a much more sociable type of work load for the workforce. So we're working 40-hour weeks instead of the norm in the industry now, which is 70 or 80 hours a week. Our cows are living for twice as long as the industrial cow. We are even taking going to the length of leaving the calf with the cow, with its own mother. And we think we can do this. We've given ourselves 3 years. We're doing it ourselves. We're tenant farmers, but we believe that the outcomes from this could be dramatic if we could prove, even to ourselves, that we can deliver adequate amounts of affordable food competitively. I know all the academics and the policy people and the farmers, and everybody thinks we're off our heads, but there's no way you can do that. But the reason we can do it is because we are applying ecological, agroecological farming policies, systems. We're using agroforestry. We're applying a lean farming system, which is reducing waste. It's internalising our cost base, so we're producing our own fertilisers and food for our animals and energy from the waste from the farm. And by doing that, we can cut our costs dramatically. And that allows us to be competitive, we believe. And on paper, we can do this, and we've just started down that road. And anyway, that's where we are. That's what we're doing. My point is more: if the polluter paid and the deliverer of ecosystem services was rewarded, it would be transformational.
Thank you very much. Any more?
Hi, I'm Libby. I'm one of the students at the Centre here for Food Policy doing a Masters. Is that loud enough now? So I'm a student here at the Centre. I know we've talked about diet in terms of food groups. If we're going to convince people to go through this transition that Tim's talked about towards eating a more sustainable diet, how do we convince them that eating this kind of diet is going to be pleasurable and convenient? Because I think that is probably one of the big barriers to getting this shift with consumers.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Yeah, Bibba Hartigan from Climates Network. Just interested to hear that most of the comments are suggesting that the major drivers of change should be governments and policy driven. But with the resistance of people towards the nanny state and messaging coming from government, how is that going to be managed? Are there other sources of information that will be favourable? I mean, if you're rejecting, on one hand, the sort of social media side and the potential for a grassroots movement to drive change, and then people have a resistance to messages from above, where will the change be motivated from?
Thank you. Any other comments? Two more at the front. Sorry.
Okay.
No, I'm just going to do one more. Sorry.
I'm Tanya. I'm a gastronomer. I was wondering, what role does education play in this, and at what age do you think would be better to start and educate let's say the children, or from elementary or middle school or in high school? Because I worked with on gastronomic campuses in Romania with teenagers, and many of them are just really confused about what's healthy, what should they eat, and there's a lot. If we adults are confused, they're even more confused. And I believe that if change is needs to happen, it has to start also in schools and in education? And how do you think that can be made possible at a, let's say, large scale?
Okay, thank you.
No, I'm Renato Maluf from the Federal Rural University of Rio in Brazil. I've got lots of comments, but I'll try to keep in two of them, to just try to make it short.
I fully agree with the idea that we need to do more research and analytical effort in taking the consumers, consumption consumers are sort of starting point to analyze the food system. And that means going down to localities. You're absolutely right. The question is that when you go down to the localities, what you're going to find is that consumers, they make their choices according to, or following different factors, different determinants, different pressures, and they end up with a diet which is a quite heterogeneous one. It's a diet that mix food from different origins with different meanings, with different chains, etc. So the transition will be more, it's not the transition from one diet to another one in order to get a sustainable diet. But we have to learn more how to deal with this complex mix that are the food diets of people. The second is, you mentioned data, Tim. The problem for most of developing and poor countries is that we don't have reliable and regular data on consumption. We've got a lot on production. This is not Bagazan. There's a reason for this. It's economic meaning. The third is that about social mobilization. This is another contrast between developing countries and rich countries, because who does more social mobilization around food and also sustainable and healthy food are farmers and farmers' organizations, not consumers. So it's quite the opposite that we used to have in rich countries. And related to that, the last point, which could be a good news, to my view, the most effective criticism on the agricultural model of production, the dominant, came from healthy concerns about the excessive use of chemicals in food. And this has been more effective in pressure, putting pressure on these farmers, especially the large farmers, as we have in Brazil. Brazil, as you probably know, is the largest market of chemicals in the world. We've been discussing and criticizing the model of production for 20 years now, using environment argument, and we did not succeed. But when the criticism comes from the healthy effects of using chemicals, yeah, they start saying, okay, let's think about it, let's try to make it more sustainable, etc. That could be good news, but it's not enough, because I mean, you probably will end up having less fruits and vegetables where you can see the chemicals more directly. It's difficult to talk about chemicals in processed food that was made with soybean, with lots of chemicals and GMOs. So there's a question in this that, I mean, it's good news knowing that health can be a strong argument for discussing sustainability. So, which means that it's easier to integrate in this sense, but it's not enough in this case.
Thank you. Okay. So, if I could ask again you to reflect back on those numerous comments, but hopefully you can see patterns in those comments. So, Tara, you want to start?
You asked me Tim to say something quickly about China. So very quickly, they revised their dietary guidelines, but I do think it was all a bit installing a teacup, because the dietary guidelines are very different, very similar to the ones that went before. They actually recommend an increase in dairy consumption and a very slight reduction in meat consumption. But the way it was framed within the kind of Chinese media was simply there was no reference whatsoever about sustainability. So what happened was that US environmental NGOs bigged the whole story up to say, look what China's doing and look what the US isn't doing. So I wouldn't say there's anything particularly radical going on there. So there's two questions about, one was about consumer confusion and fatigue. And I actually think we have too much information about food. I think we are fetishizing food. I think it's what to eat, what not to eat, this will pollute me, this will save me, Eat it. That's all. And I think the more it's as though it's back to the consumer. I'll fail my family, I'll fail my moral duties as a if I don't eat the right quantity of X, Y, and Z. This atomized approach to food is at the core of the problem. The context needs to be different, and what people will eat will follow. So it goes back to the thing, if social media doesn't work, what's going to do the job? Well, you make better food available and affordable, and you make the rubbish less available and less affordable, and then everything else, I think, will follow. People don't ask to eat quinoa, they don't ask to eat, deep fried butter. Apparently it's a thing. It becomes available, it becomes affordable, it becomes hyped on social media, and people eat it. So, and I think again that goes back to the sort of link point about education. We should be educating our children. What age should it start? Yes, but more than the kind of waving an eat well plate under the nose of a 5-year-old, it's walk the talk, put decent food in school canteens and make decent food priced and affordable so that parents can buy it. And that goes to the point somebody made about convenience and so on and so forth. And there's so much we do in our lives that we consider to be absolutely essential that frankly isn't convenient, like daily bathing. Probably I have a shower every day. I don't need to from a health perspective. It takes time out of my life, but I feel obliged to do it. And the same way I feel obliged to wash my clothes and do all these other very pointless things. So convenience is not per se. It's a mutable thing. We have a lot of leisure, but we get stressed about the leisure because we feel we should be using it in various different ways. So I think it's a bit of a kind of it's a red herring. A point also made about this idea of health and sustainability and so forth. Just one sort of nasty thing to say is that we may not be able to have it all. If we don't have a planet, we will not survive, and we may not be able to have an optimally healthy diet that sits within environmental limits. We may have to get some of our nutrients by the back door, which may include things like fortification, biofortification, and so on and so forth. And so I think this assumption that we can have a kind of an agricultural policy that delivers everything that is, it may be a bit more tricky than that. And then finally, the farmer. It sounds really interesting what you're doing, and I think it's the point about payments for ecosystem services is a kind of self-evident truth. I wish it was enacted upon. Very interesting what you're doing. I don't think it's at all inconsistent with the conclusion that we also need to eat less meat, because I don't think that's the point you were making. The animal products that we do consume need to be produced in a radically different way.
Modi? Yeah, thank you. On the farming point, congratulations. I agree with absolutely everything you say, and that's what we want to see. People being rewarded for farming and agroecological farming in the way that you do it, and those who do it in an unhelpful way should pay. User-pays principle should apply to farming. Let's hope we might get that post-Brexit in this country with our new food system that emerges. On the question, yeah.
It's going to be so good after Brexit.
Can't wait.
It's going to be so good.
That's okay. I'll show you enthusiasm, Tim, for Brexit. On the question about people being bombarded with nutrition information, completely agree with Tara on that. linked to the education, our environment simply needs to change. You know, for example, at the moment we can get junk food, chocolates everywhere, whether you're shopping in the supermarket at the checkouts, or buying petrol, or buying a newspaper, or buying clothes. You know, this stuff is everywhere, and we, you know, the precise foods we should be eating least of, you cannot get away from. So we do need to change the environment, and if you change the environment, because people will stop buying these products. So that's what we need. Linked to that, there's a good example from the school meal sector which could be transferred elsewhere in relation to changing the food environment, food system. Sodexo, is a school meal supplier, is currently doing a pilot project with WWF, and they're looking at reducing the meat content of school meals. They're looking at traditional dishes like spaghetti bolognese, and they're looking at how they might reduce the meat in those kind of composite dishes. So reducing the meat and replacing it with non-meat alternatives. The early findings are that the children aren't even noticing that these meals have changed in this way. And they've actually enjoyed the changes that are being made. There's a lot of meals out there that you can make simple changes like those that the public won't notice, and they'll still enjoy them equally, but it's not happening. So we need to work with those sections of the food industry that are willing to pilot and be innovative in developing solutions, and then use those solutions to encourage others to adopt similar approaches. And we might need some form of mandatory regulation in the process, so that we create this level playing field where all food companies are required to do that. You know, we've got a national sugar reformulation program. Why don't we have something similar where people who produce processed meals, which are quite popular, could be required to use less meat in them, for example, and increase the pulses content in ways that people might not notice necessarily. So I think that's another solution we should think about. And in relation to the nanny state arguments, and this also relates to the point being made around you know, some of the points that were coming from Brazil. We're always going to be facing nanny state arguments, but I think the solution to those is reframing the arguments. Once upon a time in the 50s, tobacco consumption was normal in this country. The evidence was emerging that it was bad for health, but doctors were smoking, people were smoking in offices, people smoked everywhere. Over time, we've managed to reframe smoking from being something that's socially accepted and normal to something that's no longer socially accepted. The products are taxed, people aren't allowed to smoke indoors, they're not allowed to smoke in restaurants. These days, only a very small proportion of the population actually smoke, and it's seen as something undesirable. So we can bring about those changes. I imagine in the 50s, the tobacco industry would have used those nanny state arguments. And the Brazil example, again, is a really good one, where for years chemicals in the food system were a problem. They tried to use environmental arguments and they got nowhere. When they reframed the chemical problem as a health problem, suddenly people were really concerned, and they were able to bring about action on that. So we need to think about how these problems and solutions are framed, and come up with alternative frames to nanny state arguments for the issues that we're promoting. That are more acceptable to society, and there are ways in which we can do that. There are examples of success, and we need to do that for this particular agenda.
Tim, we've got a couple of minutes.
Very quickly, because we've got a couple of comments more. I won't add any more about the dairy farming, because I think from us you were getting a lot of support. That the issue is not to demonise meat and dairy, but to demonize and change the mode of production. But that does, and forgive me being very stark in my opening talk, but the danger of that is this, and it's a theme in all of our discussions this evening, which is, do we have change sufficiently to get what the data say needs to change by below the radar methods? In other words, choice editing, as we call it, will it engender enough change on water reduction, biodiversity loss, climate change and land use? My reading of the data is no. It can't. It can shave off quite a lot, but it won't address the constant pressure to increase consumption of certain goods. Unless we turn off the tap of marketing from the food industry. Let me be stark to the FTF. Where's FTF? wrong place. This is the argument I always have with you lot, you know, who are very important. You're the biggest employer in Britain. You're a major world employer, huge, biggest employer in Europe. It's food manufacturing. And many of your members, FDE at European level, are doing really interesting things. I always quote Pepsi, 50% in 5 years reduction car target for CO2. It got to 37% reduction. Okay? But from a public health point of view, the only good thing Pepsi could do would be to go out of business, because it's still selling sugary nonsense. And its marketing budget is, like its friend and competitor Coca-Cola, dwarfs the public health budget. So we have a real problem from our point of view, our ivory towers, or concrete and brick towers in this case. We have a problem as, this is back to my first slide, complexity. We're dealing with complexity. There's no one evil issue that the sustainable diets agenda raises. And that really is my answer to all of the questions. I mean, in the book, Pamela Stevens, God, that takes me back. Pamela Mason and I used the SDC agenda because the SDGs said, look, we were advisors to government. So you get 2 minutes with a minister, or you get 2 minutes with a CEO of a food company, or you get 3 minutes with Mike, head of the RSPB. These are busy people, and you've got to grab them. And you've got to say, look, actually the agenda we've got to do, and you if you're interested in birds, or you if you're in food manufacturing, we're all got to change different bits of the food system. Your role is shave away below the side. But actually, unless we turn off your marketing budget, which is basically pouring out ultra-processed foods, the Brazilian nutritional epidemiologist's phrase, we won't deal with it. And this is a conflict between you and us now, which we can talk about in private in a civilized way, but outside in the public, we'll fight with each other. And that's the policy battle that now we're doing. And there are multiple of those battles. To Renato Malouf's point about Brazil, when I came to London 34 years ago to work for a public health body, I was working for anti-non-communicable diseases issues. And I shocked my board by saying, we're going to get dietary change by focusing on food safety issues. We haven't got a food safety issue problem in Britain. I said, yes, you have. It's agrochemical uses, and there's food safety figures going up. We actually got more change, dietary change, by targeting something that seemed off the agenda of NCDs, and showed the connection between the old public health agenda of food safety and the new public health agenda of non-communicable diseases. And actually, that's a much better global model, because in the developing world, NCDs are growing rapidly, and they're now huge. Corinna's work on the Global Nutrition Report shows that. But actually, there is Brazil. I don't know if you know people here. These are 3 Brazilians here. They've got the biggest death rate from agrochemicals in the world. Way, because they have totally out of control agrochemical use. So actually, you're right. In Brazil, focusing on pesticide residues, #1 cultural change agent. Much better than nudge, things like that. So to summarize all of that, what's the role for education? Well, of course, a huge role for education, but it's got to be at a mass level, not just children. If we just focus, the FDF, why am I singling them out? The FDF loves saying, let's have children's education. Of course we want children's education, but actually we've got to get change with adults now. That's trickier, actually. So, I mean, I'd go back to the beginning, Corinna. I think the whole difficulty, and I blame Tara for keeping me going on this, sustainable diets is a complexity agenda. It's about putting the bits. This is your fault, Corinna. You want us all to be about integration and comprehensive food policies. Well, sustainable diets is the consumption end of that. And it's a shorthand for that. That wherever we are, whatever sector we're in, we've got to do our bit to contribute to the big scale of consumption change. And I don't want to go against that, because the data shows that. If we just do choice editing, it won't get enough change. The FAO's report on livestock showed that. you can get the most efficient farming systems to reduce the carbon footprint of meat and dairy production. But if more people are eating more meat and dairy, all the gains are wiped out. That's what the 2013 modelling exercise showed. So we've got to address consumption. And that means us, I think it goes back to what Anne and others of you said. I think between us all, whether you're RSPB concerned about bird life or Woof Woof concerned about biodiversity, WWF, you've got to actually be addressing the need for mass consumption change. I think we've just got to do it.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. I'm afraid there's not any time for further comments, but of course do feel free to mill around and ask questions and talk to each other.
So Tim rightly said that this is a complexity agenda, and a lot of the conversations that we've had have been, and reflections that we've had have been around, you know, is it this, where is the different entry points, and the reactions we've had is we need to have actions throughout, chipping away throughout the system. But just to share my last reflection, as I was sitting here listening, I was thinking back to my morning. My daughter, who's just turned 10, literally from the moment she woke up to the moment I dropped her off at the school gate, was trying to get something called a fidget spinner out of me. I don't know whether you've come across these fidget spinners. You're 19-year-old. Well, you've allowed your 19-year-old to have one. She's seen them at school. I've never even heard of them. The whole conversation was about. She's just had a birthday and got a present, so I didn't think it was the right thing to do to, to get more and more. And I was trying to explain the link between fidget spinners and climate change. It really, it was hard. And then I was thinking, I was just trying to put it in the context of the problem with a society that's over-focused on consumerism. It was a tough conversation, but anyway, she persisted. She's learning the art of arguing, which is good. But the point is, I was thinking, look, is she responsible as a 10-year-old? Yeah. Am I responsible as a parent? And then I was thinking, well, no, it's the system that produces fidget spinners. Why should I be doing this? And I thought, hang on a minute, no, I do have a responsibility as a parent. She does actually have a responsibility as a 10-year-old. And the producers of fidget spinners and all the crap that comes out of junk food, plastic stuff, have responsibilities. Everybody has a responsibility. And it just strikes me, unless we actually get to a culture when everybody accepts that the complex agenda is not about displacing responsibility onto others, but is about everybody taking responsibility. The trouble with complexity, it's easy to say it's education, or it's producers, or it's farmers, or it's this. It's always somebody else, and unless we actually say, no, it is my responsibility as well as everybody else's responsibility, we call out the responsibility of others but also take it ourselves, I think we're going to be facing problems. So thank you very much to our speakers for that excellent debate. Thank you very much. And to you for your wonderful